In 1795, three empires sat down and did something almost no country in modern history has ever had done to it. They didn't just conquer Poland, they didn't just occupy it, they erased it. Russia, Prussia, and Austria carved up every remaining acre of Polish territory between themselves, divided the population, redrew every border, and then formally pledged in writing to never let Poland exist again. For the next 123 years, if you looked at a map of Europe, Poland simply wasn't on it. Not a smaller version, not a puppet state, nothing. 3 generations of Polish children were born, grew old, and died without their country ever appearing on a single official map, anywhere in the world. And then, on November 11th, 1918, the exact same day the First World War officially ended, Poland came back. Not as a fragment, not as a symbolic gesture. A fully restored, internationally recognized nation, rising again out of the exact 3 empires that had sworn it would never happen. So here's the question worth actually sitting with. How does a country survive 123 years of literally not existing, not as a government, not as a state, not as a line on a map, and still come back? What kept millions of people identifying as Polish for 3 straight generations when there was no Poland left to belong to? And how did 3 separate global superpowers all conveniently collapse at the exact same moment, the one moment Poland needed them to? There's a version of this story that treats the 1918 restoration as a lucky historical accident. 3 empires just happened to lose a war at the same time, and Poland just happened to be sitting there ready to reclaim its old territory. That version isn't wrong, exactly, but it skips over the genuinely hard part, the part that actually explains why Poland specifically was ready to reconstitute itself the moment the opportunity appeared, when plenty of other stateless peoples throughout history, facing similarly favorable historical accidents, never managed to pull off the same thing. This is endgame analysis. If you want the real, data-backed version of how a country gets erased and then rebuilt, subscribe right now. Before we get into it, because what happens in between the disappearance and the return is one of the most remarkable survival stories in modern European history. To understand how extraordinary Poland's eventual return actually was, you first have to understand just how total its disappearance actually was, because this wasn't a gradual decline into irrelevance. It was a deliberate, methodical dismantling, carried out in 3 distinct stages over 23 years. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had once been one of the largest and most powerful states in Europe. But by the late 18th century, internal political dysfunction had left it critically vulnerable to its increasingly ambitious neighbors. The first partition came in 1772, when Russia, Prussia, and Austria signed a treaty that stripped Poland of roughly 1/3 of its territory and half its population, ratified by Poland's own legislature. The same, under conditions that left the country weakened, but still technically independent. It was, in effect, a warning shot, and much of Europe treated it as a shocking, if survivable, humiliation rather than an existential threat. The second partition followed in 1793, and this one arrived as direct retaliation. Poland had spent the intervening years attempting genuine internal reform, adopting a progressive new constitution in 1791 that both Russia and Prussia viewed as a dangerous threat to their own interests in the region. Russian and Prussian troops invaded, and the Sejm was forced to ratify the Second Partition, while literally surrounded by Russian soldiers, stripping away huge additional swaths of Polish territory, including major cities and much of the country's economic heartland. What remained of Poland was now a shadow of its former self, its population and territory a fraction of what they'd been just 2 decades earlier. The response came in 1794, when a national uprising led by Tadeusz Kościuszko, a military commander who had also fought in the American Revolutionary War, attempted to reverse the losses through open rebellion. Despite some early victories, the uprising was crushed by overwhelming Russian military force, and in the aftermath of that defeat, Russia, Prussia, and Austria made their final decision. Rather than simply punishing the rebellion, they would eliminate the possibility of any future rebellion entirely by eliminating Poland itself. The third partition, finalized in 1795, divided every remaining piece of Polish-Lithuanian territory between the 3 powers. Across all 3 partitions combined, Poland lost roughly 741,000 square kilometers of territory, with Prussia taking 149,000 square kilometers and 2.6 million people. Russia taking 462,000 square kilometers and 3.5 million people, and Austria taking 130,000 square kilometers and 3.85 million people. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a state that had existed in one form or another for centuries, simply stopped existing. It's worth understanding just how deliberate and final the partitioning powers intended this to be, because it separates Poland's case from most other historical conquests. This wasn't simply territorial expansion by three ambitious neighbors who happened to carve up a weaker state along the way. Following the Third Partition, Russia, Prussia, and Austria formally pledged, in writing, never to allow a Polish state to reconstitute itself again, going so far as to agree they would never even use the word Poland in any official capacity going forward. Much of the rest of Europe, watching from a distance, condemned the dismemberment as an international crime without real historical precedent. But the timing worked entirely in the partitioning powers' favor. Europe's attention throughout the mid-1790s was almost completely consumed by the French Revolution and the wars it was already triggering across the continent, and no state proved willing to actually intervene on Poland's behalf, however loudly they condemned what had happened on paper. If you're finding the sheer scale of that erasure as unsettling as it should be, subscribe to EndGame analysis now, because what happened to Polish identity over the following century is where this story gets genuinely remarkable. Here's the part of this story that separates it from most other historical territorial disputes. Poland didn't just lose its government, it lost its entire legal existence as a state for 123 years, and yet Polish national identity not only survived that erasure, it arguably grew stronger because of it. The three occupying powers each pursued their own version of cultural suppression across their respective territories, but the underlying goal was consistent: dissolve Polish identity into Russian, Prussian, or Austrian identity permanently, so that even if the political situation ever shifted, there would be no meaningful Polish population left to reclaim independence. Polish language education was banned across significant portions of the partitioned territories. Russification and Germanization policies were actively enforced, pushing the Russian and German languages and cultural norms into schools, government administration, and public life, while suppressing Polish language, Polish Catholic religious practice, and Polish cultural expression wherever the occupying administrations had the authority to do so. Polish resistance to this erasure took two very different forms across the 19th century, and it's worth understanding both, because only one of them actually worked. The military form failed completely and repeatedly. The November Uprising of 1830 and the January Uprising of 1863 to 1864 were both large-scale armed rebellions against Russian rule, and both were crushed decisively, with severe reprisals following each defeat. Figures like Rommel Traugott, a leader of the January Uprising who was later executed by Russian authorities, became lasting martyrs and symbols of sacrifice, but neither uprising came remotely close to restoring Polish independence through force. The cultural form of resistance, by contrast, quietly succeeded at the one goal that actually mattered most in the long run: keeping Polish identity alive long enough for a future opportunity to eventually arrive. Underground schools operated in secret, teaching Polish language, literature, and history to children whose official education was conducted entirely in Russian or German. Secret societies preserved Polish political and cultural organizing beneath the surface of occupied daily life. The Roman Catholic Church, deeply intertwined with Polish national identity in a way that distinguished it from the Orthodox Russian and Protestant Prussian administrations governing much of partitioned Poland, became a genuinely crucial institutional vehicle for preserving language, tradition, and a shared sense of Polish peoplehood across generations who had never once lived under an independent Polish government. Think about what that actually required in practical terms, sustained over more than a century. Parents had to make a deliberate choice, generation after generation, to teach their children a language and a history that had no official recognition anywhere, that offered no practical career advantage, and that could, in various periods and in various parts of partitioned Poland, carry genuine legal risk, if discovered by the occupying administration. There was no Polish passport to eventually claim, no Polish pension system, no Polish civil service job waiting at the end of that education, nothing except the abstract, unenforceable idea that being Polish still meant something, even when there was no Poland. That's an extraordinarily difficult thing to sustain across 3 full generations, and it's worth sitting with how easily it could have simply faded out, the way plenty of other historical, linguistic, and cultural minorities have gradually assimilated into a dominant surrounding culture when given a century or more without any political structure of their own to reinforce that separate identity. Subscribe to EndGame analysis if this kind of quiet, generational survival story is exactly what you come here for, because the next crack in the system didn't come from Poland at all, it came from inside the empires occupying it. In 1905, the Russian Revolution significantly weakened Tsarist control across the Russian Empire, and for the first time in generations, Polish political movements operating inside the Russian partition were able to organize somewhat openly, forming socialist, nationalist, and agrarian political parties that began actively shaping a concrete vision for what an eventual restored Poland might actually look like. Rather than simply preserving an abstract cultural memory of what had been lost, it wasn't independence, but it was the first genuine political opening Polish nationalists had seen in over a century, and it mattered enormously for what came next. Here's the part of this story that borders on genuinely improbable. Poland's return to the map didn't happen because Poland grew strong enough to force its way back in. It happened because, for the first and only time in 123 years, all three of the empires holding Polish territory collapsed, or came close to collapsing, at essentially the exact same moment. The First World War pitted Russia against Germany and Austria-Hungary, meaning the three powers that had jointly erased Poland from the map in 1795, spent 1914 through 1918, actively fighting each other, with significant portions of the war's eastern front running directly through former Polish territory. By 1916, German and Austro-Hungarian forces had pushed Russian forces out of the Russian-controlled portion of partitioned Poland entirely, a shift that briefly put Germany and Austria-Hungary in the position of controlling essentially all historically Polish territory simultaneously, and in an attempt to manage the political complications that came with that, the two powers issued a proclamation promising an eventual German and Austrian-aligned Polish state, an offer most serious Polish nationalists viewed skeptically, as a wartime maneuver rather than a genuine commitment to independence. Then, in quick succession, everything changed. The Russian Revolution of 1917 toppled the Tsarist government entirely, removing one of the three original partitioning powers from the equation completely. On January 8, 1918, United States President Woodrow Wilson delivered his 14 points address, and point 13 explicitly called for the creation of an independent Polish state composed of indisputably Polish territory, with secure access to the sea, placing the restoration of Poland directly onto the formal agenda of the eventual peace negotiations, for the first time with genuine great power backing behind it. By November 1918, Germany and Austria-Hungary, the two remaining partitioning powers, were both collapsing as well, defeated militarily and increasingly consumed by internal revolution and political disintegration of their own. It's worth pausing on how genuinely improbable this convergence actually was, because it's easy in hindsight to treat it as an inevitable outcome. Three separate empires, governed by three entirely different political systems, fighting on opposite sides of a war that had nothing originally to do with Poland at all, somehow arrived at total or near total collapse within roughly the same 18-month window. Had the war ended even a few years earlier or later, or had any one of the three empires managed to stabilize itself while the other two remained intact, the specific historical opening that allowed Poland's restoration might simply never have arrived at all, or might have arrived in a dramatically different, more limited form. Polish nationalists throughout the 19th century had waited, organized, and periodically rebelled without ever having this specific alignment of circumstances available to them. The generation that finally got it happened to be ready, because the generations before them had spent 100 years making sure someone eventually would be. On November 11th, 1918, the exact same day the armistice ending the First World War was signed, Józef Piłsudski, a Polish military and political leader who had spent years building and leading Polish military units specifically in anticipation of exactly this kind of opportunity, became commander-in-chief of a newly forming Polish army and the de facto head of what was about to become the restored Republic of Poland. 123 years after the Third Partition had formally erased Poland from every map in Europe, Poland was back. On the very same day the war that had finally broken all three of its occupiers officially came to an end. Diplomatic recognition, though, wasn't the same thing as a settled, defensible country, and the newly restored Poland spent its first several years fighting to make the theoretical restoration into a physical, secured reality. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, formally established the Republic of Poland as an independent sovereign state, granting it portions of the historical regions of Greater Poland and Pomerania, along with access to the Baltic Sea, though notably not the city of Gdansk itself, which was instead designated a free city under League of Nations oversight, a compromise that left Poland's access to the sea narrow and, in the following decades, a persistent point of tension. Plebiscites were held in several disputed border regions between Poland and Germany, with mixed results complicated by aggressive campaigning on both sides, though a series of Polish uprisings in Upper Silesia ultimately secured an economically important portion of that contested territory for Poland. The most consequential conflict came further east. Poland's eastern border had never been clearly defined by the Versailles negotiators, and Bolshevik Russia, freshly consolidating power after its own revolution and civil war, had its own ambitions to push westward and spread communist revolution deeper into Europe. The Polish-Soviet War, fought from 1919 to 1921, became the decisive military test of whether the restored Polish state could actually defend the independence it had just reclaimed on paper. Under Piłsudski's leadership, Poland ultimately prevailed, securing an eastern border considerably further east than the peacemakers in Paris had originally envisioned, though the war also left Poland with a substantial Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Jewish minority population as a direct consequence of exactly where that final border ended up being drawn. The stakes of that specific war are worth sitting with for a moment because the outcome mattered well beyond Poland's own borders. Had Bolshevik forces broken through Poland decisively in 1920, the road toward continuing the spread of communist revolution deeper into a war-exhausted, politically unstable Western Europe would have looked considerably more open. Some historians have described the decisive Polish victory outside Warsaw in August 1920, often referred to as the Miracle on the Vistula, as one of the more consequential and underappreciated turning points of the entire 20th century. A battle fought by a nation that had, quite literally, only existed again as a state for less than 2 years at that point. Subscribe to EndGame analysis now because there's one more twist to this story that most retellings skip past entirely, and it's the one that actually matters most for understanding modern Europe. By 1921, with the Polish-Soviet War concluded and Poland's borders finally settled through a combination of treaty, plebiscite, and outright combat, the country adopted its March Constitution, formally establishing itself as a republic. A nation that had spent 123 years existing purely as a cultural memory preserved by underground schools and secret societies and generations of families who'd never once lived under Polish rule, was now, once again, a fully functioning, internationally recognized, self-governing state with defined borders and a working government. Here's where the story takes a turn most people don't fully appreciate, because Poland's 20th century after 1918 was, to put it mildly, not simple. The country endured a devastating Nazi and Soviet invasion and occupation during the Second World War, followed by more than 4 decades under Soviet-imposed communist rule after 1945. By the standard most people would use to judge national success, Poland spent most of the 20th century as anything but a triumphant comeback story. And then, starting in 1989, something happened that turned Poland's restoration from a single dramatic historical event into a genuinely sustained, ongoing transformation. The Balcerowicz Plan, implemented in the early 1990s, rapidly and aggressively transitioned Poland's economy from Soviet-style central planning to a free market system, a program of reform so sudden and comprehensive that it became known internationally as shock therapy. It involved abandoning price controls, dramatically scaling back state control over the economy, and actively encouraging the growth of a private business sector that would go on to become the primary engine of everything that followed. The results, measured over the following 3.5 decades, are genuinely extraordinary. Since 1989, Poland has maintained the longest uninterrupted period of economic expansion anywhere in European history, broken only briefly by a shallow, temporary contraction during the COVID pandemic. Poland's economy grew by a factor of roughly 17 between 1990 and 2026, climbing from $66 billion to over $1.1 trillion, making it the largest economy in Central Europe by a significant margin. In 1990, Poland's economy was smaller than Ukraine's and significantly poorer than Russia's. Today, its economy is larger than the combined economies of 14 other Eastern European countries. Poland joined NATO in 1999 and the European Union in 2004, and GDP per capita has climbed 116% since that EU accession alone, nearly 3 times the average growth rate across the entire European Union over the same period, and considerably faster than fellow fast-growing EU economies like Ireland, Romania, or Spain. Economist Noah Smith has described Poland as ranking behind only South Korea as the great economic miracle of the modern era, noting that the IMF expects Poland to soon overtake Japan, Spain, and Israel in per capita GDP entirely, and in a detail that connects directly back to the very first partition that erased this country in 1772, Poland is now projected to spend roughly 5% of its GDP on defense this year, more than any other NATO member, more than double the rate of either Germany or the United Kingdom, fielding the 3rd largest armed forces in the entire alliance behind only the United States and Turkey. Part of what makes Poland's economic transformation particularly striking is how it happened, not through a single resource windfall or a narrow financial sector boom, but through genuinely broad-based structural change. Poland attracted foreign directives, investment equal to roughly 50% of its current GDP, more than any other country in Central or Eastern Europe, bringing with it technology, expertise, and management practices that helped Polish productivity grow at an average annual rate of 3% over the past 2 decades, compared to roughly 2% across the rest of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe, and just 1% across the Eurozone as a whole over that same period. Poland's government also proved willing to invest heavily and early in financial market infrastructure. building out institutions like the Warsaw Stock Exchange, specifically to support the kind of sustained private capital formation the Belkorowicz reforms had opened the door to. None of this happened automatically, simply because central planning ended. It required more than 3 decades of consistent, compounding policy choices, echoing, in its own way, the same generational patience that had once kept Polish identity alive during the partition era, except this time channeled into building institutions rather than merely preserving culture against erasure. Pull back from the specific dates, treaties, and GDP figures, and Poland's story offers something genuinely rare in modern history: direct, measurable proof that a nation's existence and a state's existence aren't actually the same thing, and that one can survive the complete, deliberate destruction of the other for well over a century. Russia, Prussia, and Austria didn't fail to erase Poland because they lacked the military or administrative power to do so. They controlled the territory, the schools, the language of instruction, and the machinery of government for 123 consecutive years. And they used every tool available to a modern state to dissolve Polish identity permanently into their own. What they couldn't erase was something considerably harder to control through force or policy: a shared language preserved in secret classrooms, a shared religious and cultural tradition preserved through the Catholic Church, and a shared historical memory passed down through 3 consecutive generations who had personally never experienced Polish independence, but who never stopped considering themselves Polish anyway. When the specific, narrow historical window opened in 1918, all 3 of the occupying empires collapsing within the same few years, that preserved identity is what gave Poland an actual population ready and willing to immediately reconstitute a functioning state, rather than a fragmented set of territories with no shared sense of what they were supposed to become. That's the real lesson sitting underneath this entire story, and it's one worth remembering whenever a modern conflict raises the same underlying question about a people's identity outlasting the state built around them. Borders can be erased by treaty. Governments can be dissolved by force. But the thing that actually makes a nation, a shared identity, a population, is willing to preserve quietly and patiently across generations who have every practical reason to simply give up and assimilate, turns out to be extraordinarily difficult to erase completely, even with 123 years and 3 empires all trying at once. It's worth remembering, too, that Poland's story didn't end in 1918 or even in 2004. The same pattern: patient, generational persistence through genuinely difficult conditions, followed by rapid transformation once the structural obstacles finally lifted, shows up again in the post-1989 economic story just as clearly as it does in the 19th century cultural survival story. A nation that spent 123 years being told it no longer existed, and then spent much of the following century under Nazi occupation and Soviet-imposed communism, has still managed, within the lifetime of people watching this video, to become one of the fastest growing, most economically significant, and most militarily consequential countries in all of Europe. That's not simply a lucky historical accident happening twice to the same country. It's a pattern, and understanding the pattern tells you something real about what this specific nation has proven. Repeatedly, it's capable of doing when the conditions finally allow it. If this breakdown gave you a fuller picture of how a country survives its own erasure and comes back stronger than before, subscribe to EndGame Analysis, because we're going to keep tracking Poland's current role as one of Europe's fastest growing economies and most significant military powers. Tell me in the comments, can you think of another nation that survived a total loss of statehood this long and still came back? Or is Poland's case genuinely unique in modern history? I read every comment. They shape what we cover next. One final number worth carrying with you after this video ends: 123 years is longer than the entire lifespan of the United States at the time this video was made, minus barely 2.5 decades. It's longer than most modern nations have existed in their current form at all, and Poland spent every single one of those years not existing on paper, while somehow ensuring that when the paper finally caught up to reality again, there was still a nation there ready to fill it back in. This has been EndGame Analysis. Stay sharp.